Thank you for downloading Atypical, the podcast. If you enjoy our work, all we ask is that you leave us a review in your podcast player and share it with your friends. It helps us reach more people, and it's always great to hear from you. Thank you again, and we hope you enjoyed this episode of Atypical, the podcast.
Hello and welcome to Atypical, the podcast where we look at life from a more atypical perspective. My name's Simon Heather, your host, and I'm joined by a fabulous guest this week.
Yeah, hello everyone. I'm Danny. Happy to be here.
Brilliant. Yeah, we've been talking on and off on social media for a while. Been trying to sort of line up a time to get you on because you have interesting things. We've gone international, you see. So
yes, in multiple ways. I'm American. I don't know if my accent gives me away, but I'm based in the Netherlands. So yeah.
Yeah. Well, so you've picked up some nice European twists to your words there. So that's
I have. I have a very cosmopolitan accent that doesn't really fit anywhere anymore. So yeah.
I mean, I grew up in the Far East, so my accent certainly doesn't fit with what I used to sound like. So
yeah. Well, interesting.
I had a somewhat culturally mixed accent, and then since university in the UK, I've sort of ended up with this odd one. But so there you go. There's a potted history of me there. But
I wouldn't have noticed, but yeah, always interesting to hear.
Well, I think it says something about sort of your accents are a really odd one, aren't they? Because they sort of they're representative not just of where you've come from, but where you are now. And it's amazing. I think especially amongst neurodivergent people, is sometimes it becomes almost like a camouflage thing, like a mirroring thing. You start picking up the accents and words of the people around you, possibly more quickly. I don't know if there's an identity thing there or.
Well, part of it for me is I've done this my whole life. I mean, it's sort of like this echolalia or mimicking thing. I'm autistic, so it's like even as a kid, I grew up in Chicago and I had family from the American South. And after one day spending time with my extended family, I'd have this Southern accent.
Oh wow!
Because I just pick it up and it's fun for me to mimic accents and languages.
Yes.
So I think my accent has changed more than most people's typically would. I've been living abroad for about 10 years. And so I've been around international students and people from all over the world. And I adjust my accent around like whoever I'm speaking to. So it's I think most people's accent wouldn't have changed as much as mine did.
Like I say, I find it fascinating, and it's something I notice more with neurodivergent people is that I think maybe it's a protective mechanism, maybe, or it's just part of the fact that we try and always fit in better. It's fascinating. Yeah. Definitely something I need to do some research on because that's
could be a whole episode, but
I think it probably is because I have to say I would not have said Chicago because I've got a friend from Chicago who's lived in the UK for about 10 years, and he's still got quite a strong accent.
But then when I'm back in Chicago, give me 1 or 2 days, and then it's right back. So it's very interesting.
I mean, in fairness, if I spend any time with my brother, I start speaking with a West Country accent. So
interesting. Yeah.
Yes. We'll save that for another day, listeners, because there's a few things we wanted to talk about today. First of all, this episode goes out on Friday, the 1st of December, which is World AIDS Day, and I'll talk about that separately. Hello, it's Simon in post-production, because I meant to say this last night when we recorded, and I got distracted because that's what happens when you have two quite ADHD people talking on a podcast. We get distracted. I did want to mention today, December the 1st, which is World AIDS Day, and it's been observed for quite a few years now, and it's a fairly significant occasion. It's dedicated to raising awareness about AIDS, which is acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, which is normally caused by the spread of HIV, which is the human immunodeficiency virus. And the 1st of December is there to remember those who unfortunately have died because of the disease or complications caused by it. But also it's to celebrate advances in treatment and indeed prevention of it. You know, HIV was first clinically observed in 1981, at almost the same time in both the United States and the UK. And whilst it was initially identified in young gay men, and obviously that led to misconceptions about it being a gay disease, which unfortunately still lasts today, and one day we might even cover some of the horrific public service films that were put out about this, because holy hell, they were bad. But it became clear pretty damn quickly that it could affect anyone. As for the likely origin of it, I'm not going to go into that because there are lots of stories about that. But it does appear to come from, it's a spread that sort of made its way throughout the 1980s, and it spread globally, affected millions of people. Today, I believe we're somewhere around 40 million people. And the disease was heavily stigmatized. Sometimes today even it is still stigmatized. And it has a huge association with more marginalized groups, which obviously hindered and that sort of early prevention and treatment effort. Many people seeing it as, God's wrath or other stupid things. But what's incredible is that the first antiretroviral drug, AZT, was actually approved for treatment in 1987. Barely 6 years from the very first observation to a marketable antiretroviral, which is pretty incredible, really. And over the years, massive, massive advances have been made, which has effectively transformed HIV from being a fatal diagnosis to being much more of a manageable chronic condition. I know people who've got it who are well into their 80s now. And the thing which I take is called PrEP, which is pre-exposure prophylaxis. And it's something which is available free, certainly in the UK, to anyone who has same-sex relations. And it's something which I highly recommend any of my friends sort of get onto, just because it helps us to destigmatize everything around this. And it's a straightforward prevention. It's a single tablet, done. It's an absolute breakthrough in that prevention, because you simply take a pill once a day, and that has a 99.999% reduction in the risk of passing on HIV infections. And that's in people who are in the high-risk group. So that then is a huge benefit to people who, for example, men who have sex with men, but also heterosexual people who have a higher risk with certain behaviours. For example, they inject drugs or take part in other sexual activities. And because of this introduction in PrEP, countries where you have an accessible program have seen a massive reduction in new infections. So, for example, in my own city where I live in London, and where some of my best friends live in San Francisco, there's been a significant drop in new diagnoses because of this. And that does give a certain level of empowerment and control to individuals, especially, again, those in those high-risk groups, because it gives them control over that prevention strategy. And it's been, according to a good friend of mine who works in this world, it's been an absolute game changer in sexual health, especially for those who, for whatever reason, might not have always been able to negotiate condom use. But the community impact of it and the widespread use of PrEP has the potential to significantly reduce the number of new HIV infections, which is obviously vital for achieving a global goal of ending AIDS as a disease. But like I said, World AIDS Day does serve as a reminder for the ongoing fight against HIV/AIDS. It is a day to reflect on how far we've come in terms of treatment and prevention, and things like the development of PrEP, and I guess really for all of us to recommit to efforts to end this epidemic. The history of HIV/AIDS is a story of immense tragedy, but also of resilience and, to an extent, scientific triumph. It highlights the importance of global solidarity and innovation and community engagement in tackling what many see as being one of the more challenging public health crises of the last 50 years. Thank you so much, and we're back to the podcast. But also, what's quite interesting for us is that the 3rd of December is International Day of People with Disabilities. And things like autism and ADHD and dyslexia and dyspraxia and all the things that we often talk about on this podcast, certainly in the UK, count as disabilities under the Equality Act. And I think in America, they're covered by the Americans with Disabilities Act, and there's certainly bits and pieces in places like Australia and across Europe as well. There are various pieces of legislation that sort of talk about this. And I think it's quite interesting is the way in which different places look at disability in general. We've talked in the past a little bit about the different models of disability. I'm sure you've come across these before, Danny. Is the things like the charitable model and the medical model and the social model and stuff.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. I'm jumping ahead a bit.
No,
now,
please.
But I noticed that the theme. By the way, normally I would prepare for something like this. I did no preparation because my day was a bit chaotic. But I did.
In fairness, I did about 5 minutes of preparation because.
Good. But I noticed that the theme, so the International Day of Persons with Disabilities.
Yeah, what is the theme this year? I've not actually looked. Isn't that
So it's
dreadful?
sponsored by the United Nations, and this year it's United in Action to Rescue and Achieve the SDGs, that's Sustainable Development Goals, for, with, and by persons with disabilities. So when they say for, with, and by, they've sort of covered all of these various models of disability.
Yes, they have, haven't they? Yes.
It just sort of covered all their bases. So to not offend anyone, for people with disabilities, that's sort of charitable.
Yeah.
With, I'm not sure what that is. By, that's sort of self-advocacy. Right.
Yeah, so with I would say sounds a little bit medical model to me.
Yeah, it does. Yeah. So I found that interesting.
Yeah, it is because obviously the for always that makes me shudder slightly because that's the charitable model, which to me stinks of sort of like paternalism and lack of agency and creating dependency and pity, I think. And it's the one that I always just dislike the most, I must admit.
Agreed.
And then, the medical model has some benefits. I was talking about this actually with somebody at work the other day because we try and push the social model. So Marianne and I work together for a large organisation, and we run the disability network there. And we had this discussion with somebody the other day about social model and medical model. And somebody was saying, oh, we should only ever use the social model. It's terrible to use the medical one. And we went, well, what about ADHD? Because that is quite an easy, we can define what it is because it, the way in which it works in the brain and neurotransmitters and all of that lovely stuff around dopamine. So actually having the medical model there and having a diagnosis is useful because you can get things like I have, which is the lisdexamphetamine, which is Elvans, I think it's the name most people know it as, which gives me the ability to like focus. So it is interesting how those different things work because, of course, socially you can define yourself as you see fit because it's society that actually disables you more than anything else. But also my brain disables me. So I don't know. It's an odd one. I need to think about that more. You can tell I've really not prepared because my brain is just twirling.
I have a lot of thoughts on everything you were saying, and then a couple things threw me off. So I'm sitting with a laptop and a desktop computer behind it. That's an Apple computer. And I said something that triggered I can't say it, but she'll...
Oh, yes, the name of the Apple assistant.
Yes. Started talking, and you might hear that on the recording. And I was trying to... So this I'm getting my back on track, but you've opened up a lot of really interesting points. I've thought a lot about ADHD, and I think that part of this has to do with like social movement dynamics. For me, it's like what's practical. I think a lot of, I'll say, ADHDers, people with ADHD, are trying to like justify that I'm autistic and ADHD, so I can say we are trying to still prove that we are struggling or disabled because a lot of people don't take ADHD as seriously or think it's, a bit of a trend or something. So it's useful to say, well, look how disordered, in quotes, I am. Look, there's medical evidence of dopamine production dysregulation and this and that. And it's a bit strategic, I think, to say, like, this is a medical issue and therefore it should be taken seriously. Whereas autistic people have struggled for almost the opposite to say, well, stop pathologizing us.
Well, yeah.
Right. So it's coming at it from almost completely different directions. I find that really fascinating, if that makes sense.
I wonder if there's sort of the historical context behind it, what with sort of autism sometimes being treated as, I mean, obviously, a certain Nazi doctor whose name we shall not sully ourselves with.
Right.
And a lot of the research of sort of autism being either you are, a high functioning name of that person or somebody with sort of what we would now say, has additional support needs or something. And things like the R slur were often used. Whereas I think with a lot of ADHD people, it's kind of like that odd thing of like the medical model sees it as something to be fixed within the individual, and there is potentially some truth behind that. Certainly for me, as an ADHD autistic person, there is, because the meds actually work when I remember to take them.
Yeah.
Within that social model, sort of looking at how the organisation of society kind of negatively impacts those of us with ADHD. And certainly I know a lot of people who have got it undiagnosed often struggle with anxiety and depression. And that can cause you to mask the ADHD, which then makes it harder to accurately diagnose it. And then because of that, as you said, that sort of misunderstanding in society of those symptoms can create odd stereotypes.
Yeah, yeah.
And if you don't meet that stereotype, then you're obviously not ADHD, because you're not bouncing off the walls and you're not an 8-year-old child.
Exactly. And it's also like, well, there's a lot going on here, I think. But like think of ADHD as like inherently disabling. This is so hard to parse out because I think the social model does explain still most of this. It's just so hard to imagine a society in which ADHD wouldn't be disabling, because the one we live in, it's a huge disadvantage. So,
oh yeah, absolutely.
It's hard to think, is there a time in history or a place in the world where this wouldn't be disabling? It's just so our society, our economic, social structures are such that, well, ADHD is, very inconvenient, to say the least. Yeah.
Have you been reading my school reports again?
Or mine, yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Oh goodness me! I honestly, I look through some of my old school reports, and it's like, how did nobody realize this? Where it's sort of, you could see the subjects where I was getting into sort of, or I guess the autism brain probably helps there. It's like really concentrating. I loved the subjects, and I found out more about it even than the teachers, and the ones where I was just distracted constantly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Disruptive and other things, and then like joy to have in the class. It's like, this is a very spiky profile.
Yeah, that sounds familiar. Yeah.
I mean, throw the dyslexia in there as well, and goodness me.
Yeah, I'm not dyslexic, but I listened to the episode of this podcast on dyslexia, and I learned a lot. So yeah.
Well, I keep meaning to. I've actually written my notes now. At some point, I will sit down and record the episode on like the history of dyslexia and the understanding of it and how it's changed over the years. And I now feel I need to do that for ADHD as well.
Yeah, that's yeah.
Again, the problem of recording a podcast with a majority neurodivergent group of people is that we get lots of interesting ideas and then we distract ourselves.
Yeah.
Which is possibly why it bounces around. Actually, there was a thing I wanted to ask you about.
Sure.
Because I spotted earlier on, because I follow you on Twitter, because you're an interesting tweeter, you were doing the autism quotient again, and you asked a question about the theatre or the museum, which I think is question 24.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Do you want to tell us a bit about what, like...
Yeah, so... Okay, so where do I begin? So I tweet. I have a few different Twitter accounts, but last year or so, after I realized I was autistic and diagnosed autistic, I started this this Twitter, or now X, account, where I could just be unashamedly neurodivergent and connect with other neurodivergent people. So that's the sort of background. And well, it was last year that I was diagnosed as autistic, almost exactly 1 year ago.
It was when happy anniversary.
It was mid-December when I actually got the piece of paper that says I'm autistic. And so last year was very emotional, and there was, that whole year, I took a lot of these tests and questionnaires and everything.
Yeah.
I had done that before, but I didn't. They're very confusing, these
to put it mildly, yes.
Yeah. We'll get into that, I'm sure. But anyway, so last year I was taking a lot of these, and I guess sometimes I'm nostalgic for that a little bit about this period of understanding that I was autistic. That was really hard, but so life-changing that I find myself kind of nostalgic for going through this process. And part of that was taking all these tests and questionnaires, even though they're really problematic. But the reason I was taking it today is just I was procrastinating, and had a lot of trouble. I was working at home, but really struggling to focus. And I just went down all these rabbit holes and ended up there. And so there's several different autism questionnaires well, they're all flawed, but
Well, yes.
the AQ, there's the AQ 10, that's 10 questions, and there's the autism quotient standard one that's 50 questions. And it was devised by Simon Baron Cohen, who also I have mixed opinions about.
We've talked about him on the podcast before.
Okay, yeah. He's contributed a lot, but also some things where I'm a bit skeptical.
Yes.
Yeah, to say the least. But yeah, these questions are so arbitrary and so hard for autistic people to answer because they lack context. So the question is something like, would you prefer to go to the theater or a museum? And I have literally no idea which one is supposed to be the one
answer.
the autistic choice.
and what is the difference between the two? Because if I go to a major international museum in a big capital city, it's going to be full of people and noise and children running about and screaming, and that's just a sensory nightmare.
Exactly.
But if I go to the theatre, they might do singing and dancing around me, and that sometimes is great, and sometimes is no, there's too much going on.
Yeah, so I have to sit still for more than an hour, which is not easy for me.
Oh, goodness me, no.
And well, but on the other hand, it's dark and there's no expectation to talk to people, but a museum's full of interesting stuff. So it's just like these questions are just like they're
not helpful.
It's like the preferences of one autistic person. It's like, surprise, autistic people have like personality traits that might differ from other autistic people. Some might like the museum and some might like the theater. So it's very strange.
My God, are you suggesting that we might be individuals with different places on the spectrum?
I mean, we need more research to be sure, but no. But yeah, but I did a poll to see for autistic Twitter, and I did that a few hours ago, and I think about 30 or 40 people answered, and I think now about 2/3 of people said museum. But the results will be in tomorrow. Yeah. So yeah.
But I'd be suspicious if it's anything much different from sort of 50-50, to be honest.
Yeah, that's what I'm expecting. Well, the comments are interesting. Yeah.
Yes, I mean we'll do an episode soon, I think, on the different ones, because there's obviously AQ 50, which is the one that's often used, but there's also now things like the CATI, and there's a few others as well, which are sort of interesting and worth looking at. We might have to talk through those with other people.
And the most interesting one, which is the research that. The researchers who designed this were careful to point out that it's not specifically an autism test, but the monotropism questionnaire.
Oh, yes, that's an interesting one, isn't it?
To me, it's the most fascinating. Yeah. But that might be another episode.
We're just, getting all the listeners now going, I have to come back and listen to more stuff.
Exactly, yeah.
But yes, so alongside obviously it being International Day of People with Disabilities, and just sort of going back to that for, by and with thing, I know there's some stuff you've been doing recently about improving access to stuff around neurodiversity, and I don't know if you wanted to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. So I am an academic. I'm an assistant professor of political science, and well, going through my own struggles as a neurodivergent disabled person in the workplace. I'm also a teacher, a lecturer, so it's really opened my eyes to the struggles of students and fellow staff members. And quickly, so I guess to give some background, I've was diagnosed ADHD, let's say more than 15 years ago. I was an adult then already, but
so you've known for a while, yeah.
So I'm in my mid-30s, and that was my early 20s. And I was diagnosed autistic last year. But so I've thought about neurodiversity and so on for a long time, but it wasn't until I realized I'm autistic that I went much deeper into neurodiversity and disability. I didn't consider myself disabled. That was a big change in my thinking. To also, well, I guess I didn't feel like, I felt a bit like an imposter or something. Well, there are people who are really disabled, and well, who am I to claim that, right? But well, I am, right?
Well, yeah.
So that was a big. I guess what I'm getting at is that this journey that I've been on, my personal life and my research and my work life, has brought me a bit into the the wider disability rights movement. So I have ambitions to like expand this at my university, and I found some allies in other parts of the university that are already working
Fantastic.
on disability rights and accessibility. So I found the right people. It's very slow going though, because there's not money for it. It's very hard to encourage, to convince, management and so on that this is a necessity. And there's also on top of that, the fact that, I am disabled, and part of that means I'm often in burnout, and I get very lofty ideas about activism and advocacy and so on, and then the reality is I just need to come home and play Zelda or something, or take a nap instead. And so that's the struggle too, is
managing your own energy levels and everything, that the how difficult the working day can be, and how much takes all the spoons away from us, but we've got all these things we want to do. You end up feeling, certainly this is me, I end up feeling sometimes a bit of a failure, because there's lots of things that I think I should be doing, that I feel like I should be doing, but I can't. I have worn myself out with work or with people, or and you end up thinking, effectively you end up blaming yourself, because you've air quotes wasted an entire day, but actually you've just been recovering.
Exactly.
And it's that kind of, I think this is why it's important to say it is disabling, because I know a lot of autistic people who get quite angry actually when I suggest that it's a disability, because they go, I'm not actually disabled. And I go, well, you spend all day, you talk to people and stuff, but then when you go home, do you have to hide under the duvet or play Zelda for a few hours before you can do anything else? And they go, well, yeah, maybe a bit. Yeah, actually. It's like, well, does that mean sometimes you go to work and you cannot do anything because you've got the ADHD is going off in your head and you can't focus, and the mountain in front of you might only be putting away some clothes, but you just have to sit there and look at them for a few hours because you can't.
Yeah.
And so it's disabling.
Yes. Yeah.
I thought it was really interesting what you just said there about when you discovered it, because and I did the same thing that you've just described there. Is I ended up sort of diving into trying to learn as much as I could about sort of all these different neurovariations, and it's a really difficult thing, because I keep coming up against information that, probably going back to that medical model thing, it focuses on deficits and challenges, or people who talk about how to act more normal, or it's which is kind of disempowering to say the least.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it's the more I think about it, and although I initially was like kind of anti-deficit, and deficit is a really difficult and painful word, actually, isn't it?
Yeah.
Challenges. Actually, sometimes the challenges are real.
Yeah.
And that's where that inaccessibility thing, where that disability part of it comes from. And sometimes trying to explain to someone, I'm not lazy, I don't have the spoons. I cannot do this at the moment.
Yeah, exactly. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding around disability, especially as it relates to neurodivergence, and like how it relates to the idea of the neurodiversity paradigm. So there's a misconception that the idea of the neurodiversity paradigm, this like presupposes that neurodivergence is like a strength, or that it's always something to be
the superpower thing.
Or superpower. That's a misconception. I think that there's a version of neurodiversity, maybe on social media or marketing or something, that frames it that way. But the idea of neurodiversity is just the simple fact that different nervous systems are different. And the neurodiversity paradigm is that, we shouldn't seek a cure, but we should celebrate different. It doesn't imply that it's always fun to be autistic or neurodivergent, that it's always easy. It's both. Like, we can celebrate difference and also recognize that it's really, really hard to be neurodivergent in our societies, I think. Yeah,
absolutely. I think, sort of alongside these sort of like people talking about the superpowers, we do need to recognize those, I guess, raw frustrations of sometimes I have a complete and utter inability to read social cues.
Yeah.
Sometimes I'm quite good at it. I do sometimes think that I'm actually quite a social autistic person. Bearing in mind I then need, 2 days to hide under my duvet and play
Right.
Satisfactory because
Yes.
I can't concentrate on Zelda. Or sometimes I can't control my speech and my stutter comes back.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
sometimes I can stand up in front of 500 people and give a talk about something. I mean, I guess you probably experience something similar if you're teaching. Is that sometimes it's easy to stand up in front of the class and talk, and everything's immediately at your mental fingertips. And other times you have to dig out all your notes and have to look at them and be.
Oh yeah. I mean, like, I don't know. I don't know how much I should get into my own story, but like, I'm amazed that I got to this point. Really, when I think
I know the
back,
feeling.
like it was a struggle. So this sort of imposter syndrome voice where I thought, well, I'm not disabled. If I look back on how much I struggled, it was hard getting there, and I still struggle every day. I mean, there are days when things are going really well by whatever standard.
Mm-hmm.
I'm masking. I'm having a productive day. Again, productive in quotes. And I think, well, I'm not disabled anymore. And then I need 2 or 3 weeks to recover, and I lose basic functions. And
Oh yeah,
that's
that
yeah,
executive function just comes and goes.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, and trying to explain that to people and trying to get people to accept that, I think is really difficult because
yeah.
I was doing some research into disability in general, and I know the figures for the UK are something like 1 in 7 people has some form of disability, but of that, 80% have a non-visible disability, and that includes things like neurodivergence, but it also includes a whole plethora of other things like diabetes, for example, or one of my colleagues who has endometriosis, which means that she has incredibly painful periods, which basically knock her off for 2, sometimes 3 days. And so, but other people might just see it as, oh, she's just making a mountain out of a molehill.
Yeah.
Because sometimes I think that we do have this unfortunate thing in society of, if I cannot see you in a wheelchair or, missing a limb or something, or, using a cane and a dog, you're not actually disabled. And I think sometimes we get that kind of own internalized ableism that says, oh, you're not actually disabled, you're just, weak or something. And that's where a lot of, certainly for me and a lot of my friends, that sort of depression and anxiety and imposter syndrome comes in.
Exactly.
And managing that and having people accept that actually sometimes you are great, you are perfect, you're on it, you can produce work that is of the highest standard they've ever seen. And sometimes there's a month where you can't get your brain into gear.
Yeah. That would be one of like the biggest change, like social changes I'd like to see, is that this is just understood, like no questions asked. I mean, I think we would have a lot of sympathy if someone says, I can't do it today, right?
Yeah.
We don't need an explanation, but a lot of people would need an explanation, and it's on us to try to justify. And it's so tiring to explain or justify that I'm more likely to say, you know what, I'm fine, I'll do it, and then go over my limits, because people don't understand.
Yeah.
That's one thing I'm trying. So going back to my work.
Yes. So we started talking about what stuff you're doing for students.
Yeah, like, so I haven't, like, I don't have a lot of successes to report or anything, but the biggest change that's really simple, but one thing that I've started to do is when I write a syllabus, I have a disability statement. And it's detailed, and I really mean it. I don't remember exactly what I say. I don't have it in front of me, but it's just I take disability seriously. If I give some examples, not all disabilities are visible. If you need any accommodation, you can talk to the study advisor, but you can also talk to me. And then I talk about it in the first day of class, and students then come to me. And so I have students who will come up and say, hey, thank you for doing that. No one has ever done that. I'm autistic. Is there a way to make these lights dimmer in the lecture hall? Yes, no problem. In that case, I said, by the way, I'm autistic too, and I hate these lights, so it's no problem. And
that's amazing.
I think that was life-changing for that student because they have a model, sort of a role model, and we could talk openly about accommodations that this student needed. But the problem is, this isn't...
That's not common, is it?
it's not common. And so that's what I would like to see happen. Okay, so first of all, this has to go beyond my department. Has to go
absolutely, yeah. It needs to be everyone
has to go beyond my university. It has to go beyond my city. But all I can do is sort of, try to make change where I am. And so I would like this to somehow be, well, standard practice, but that involves training my fellow lecturers, which would probably mean that I would be the one leading it, which again comes down to resources and time. So
and the
sure.
pressure on yourself, yeah.
Exactly. So everyone can write a disability statement on their syllabus. It doesn't mean they'll know what to do with it. So there needs to be some central, I don't know, office or resources where lecturers can come and say, okay, a student told me they're dyslexic, and what can I do about that? And then there's resources available. So that's what I would like to see happening.
Yeah, no, I entirely agree. I mean, it's something I've started trying to do at work. Is whenever I arrange a meeting now, I just include a little line in it that says, if you have any access needs or inclusion needs, please let me know.
Yeah.
Because then at least, if it's somebody who says, I know you're doing it in person, could we have a Teams link or a Zoom link as well, because then I can use closed captions, for example. And I've found that since just including that single line, I've had better engagement with a bunch of my colleagues, both internal and external, but also just generally I've thought, there's a whole bunch of meetings and things I go to that are not really that accessible, and should I say something?
Yeah, exactly.
And trying to build up, I guess. The big one at the moment is building up allies. We have that across all of the different things. We have people who are disability allies and queer allies and everything else. And I think if we could find more non-disabled people who will carry the baton a little bit for us and help us with that. Certainly for me, it would help an awful lot. Occasionally being able to go to someone, help.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah.
But no, I went to university in 2006, and I had help in the UK. We have something
That's
called.
That's when I started too. So.
Yeah. Oh well, there you go. You got far better. You're an academic. I'm slightly failed at everything I've done so far. But. It's ADHD. Honestly, I've had 4 careers so far. This is not good. I'll let you
go on. But my story is, it's not as linear or straightforward as you might think. But anyway, go on.
Fair enough. So yeah, I went to university, and we still have technically in the UK something called the Disabled Students Allowance, which gives a certain amount of extra money for people going into higher education to get things they needed, and it meant that I was able to get my own laptop. I got a scanner. I got a shotgun mic and tape recorder things. I could listen to lectures afterwards.
Yeah.
And that really helped me at university. But the level of actual support that was available, pretty minimal. And my brother's not long finished university, and I sort of looked at what he was offered, and it was so much better than what I had. And so part of me is quite pleased to hear that. I looked at it and thought, I still get more from my own company than he got as a student at university, which feels out of kilter to me. And I wish he'd had a little bit more, but I have a feeling stuff is going in the right direction, but very slowly.
Yeah, I think so too. And well, I would like to have some optimism in this episode. But one thing that I fear is that when we run into austerity or financial crisis, I see this on a small scale at my university. We have a budget crisis. Well, suddenly it's a bit trickier to ask for things for resources for disabilities.
Yes, it gets cut very quickly, doesn't it? Interestingly enough.
Yeah. So it's really a struggle to say, no, this is not something extra. This is crucial, right? This is not negotiable. Like, this is necessary to incorporate this stuff. That's hard to advocate for. Yeah.
And I think that's exactly the right word is advocacy. And we have to both be self-advocates and advocates for others, because otherwise things won't change. But we do also have to be aware of our own energy levels and ability to do stuff, because burnout is a real thing, and it's not something I'd ever wish on anybody, having suffered it myself. You're doing exactly the right thing of helping your students where you can, but you're absolutely right, it needs to be on a much wider scale. How we achieve that there's a mixture of things there, but not just trying to change society, but as you rightly point out, it's sometimes getting funding and push from our own organisations to talk about disability and say we are all here, we are among you, and sometimes it's absolutely fine to say I don't really know much about that. Can you tell me about it?
Yeah, exactly. No, so I agree. Like, this is really important. And like, I don't mean to minimize our own like efforts within, our workplaces, but it got me thinking too, like the majority of disabled people are unemployed. So the next question is like, okay, how do we can't lose sight of that, right? As well.
Yeah, well, this is where I think our specific disabilities are even more important, because again, I'm going to have to use UK statistics because they're the ones I know off the top of my head. Is that around 50% of people with a disability are out of work long term in the UK? So that's people who are what's termed as economically active or inactive.
Yeah.
But people who've got autism, 21% of us are in work.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's 4 in 5 who are not.
Mm-hmm.
And that's for people who've got formal diagnoses and so forth, because statisticians only like to look at bits of paper, don't like to look at people.
Right.
I say this knowing at least one friend who's a statistician who's now going to text me when they listen to this podcast. But it's incredible. You're absolutely right. It's the level at which a lot of disabled people are, I guess, excluded in many ways from the world of work because of the way in which society deals with their disability. Now, of course, there are some people whose support and care needs is such that they may never be able to work in almost anything. But I think we owe it to ourselves as a species to try and make it so that actually anyone can partake if they wish to. Certainly, I find that work is actually something of an escape for me a lot of the time, because if I am sat around doing nothing, I end up in my own head, and that's never a good place to be.
Yeah, me too. Yeah.
And I quite like what I do for my job. I'm autistic, but I'm a project manager. I don't like change, but my job is change.
Yeah.
I quite like that dichotomy and sort of contravent that word. Nope, I forgot what I was going to say. I don't know where I was going.
I'll pick it up. I also feel really lucky. So my job, probably like yours, it's hard. There are times when I really struggle with burnout and everything, but I can't imagine doing anything else. Like, sometimes I feel like I barely can do this. There are times when I'm really pessimistic and think I'm deep in burnout. I can't do this. But I can't imagine any job that I could do that would be better suited to my brain, right? Because it's flexible, it's creative, it's analytical. I mostly work alone, but I'm not completely isolated. And so it's a mix of privilege and like determination that I ended up there, because I think I knew deep down that I couldn't work in like other, I don't know, jobs where I'd have to deal with customers all the time or something. Or
anyone who can work retail has my absolute no.
and then I had the privilege that I was able to, get this level of education and everything. So I ended up in a job that works for me. If I didn't have this privilege, not that I was like enormously wealthy or something, but enough privilege that I could get this level of education and everything, if I didn't, my life would look a lot different. I think about that too.
Yeah, I do often play the what if game to myself.
Yeah.
That therein lies madness for me, though. So that must be a problem for me. But yes, I it's really interesting to hear that you are trying to do that, and I wish more lecturers were like that, because I think it would certainly make things a fair bit easier.
It's so easy to do that, but I feel like for people who don't understand it from their own experience, it probably seems really complicated. I'm guessing. They're like, well, why would I do that? Or how would I make that fair? How can everyone choose to where they sit? But it should just be obvious. I don't know.
Yes.
Yeah.
We should just make it all part of and parcel of what we do with people every day. It's something that Sam and I talked about in the last episode. We were talking about trans allyship. Yeah. And the very simple things you can do just to make someone feel more included, feel like they belong. And I think this is all part and parcel of it. Is how do we create a society that we want to live in and is comfortable and is more accessible and inclusive to others who might have a different lived experience.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, no, and so no, it's fascinating to hear what you're doing there, and all the rest of it, and jumping back about 5-6 steps. For you said it was the international year thing of the 4 by and so forth.
Yeah.
Talking about the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN. There's 17 of them. I've just been looking them up. I won't read them all out for the listener, but I'll put a link into the show notes. But there's at least 2 or 3 in there that I think touch on sort of these kind of subjects around sort of the agency and giving people accessibility to education and everything else. And that's, we tend to be pro ability to access education and certainly pro choice and pro agency on this podcast. So that works well for us.
There are several SDGs. The SDGs actually relate to my research a bit, but so you could connect many of them to disability.
They're all interconnected, really, aren't they?
But some are more more directly related. Like there's good health and well-being, maybe. Quality education.
Reduced inequalities.
Yeah, those may be the most directly related.
Peace, justice, and strong institutions.
Yeah. And then, of course, all of these are intersectional. So poverty, gender, all of these are related intersectionally with disability. Yeah.
And, of course, intersectionality, as explained by Kimberly Crenshaw, a black professor, female professor at Columbia, I believe. So.
I think so, yes.
I'm going to have to do an episode on that at some point, aren't I?
I think she coined the term back in the 80s or 90s.
But yeah, it's all of these things.
1989, yes.
Wow.
How race, class, gender, and other characteristics intersect with each other and reinforce each other. Right.
Yeah, and that's, I think, a lot of what we've just been talking about in our own experiences of even just within our own brains, those reinforcements and intersectionalities of them. It's fascinating.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I think we've been talking for a while.
Yeah.
So was there a point to this episode other than getting to meet the wonderful Danny? Obviously, I think there is. It's partly to be aware of disability. I think because obviously, like I say, Sunday is International Day of people with disabilities. So let's celebrate ourselves for being different, but still being human. And the one thing I would like to think that we've always aimed to do, certainly on this podcast, and what I aim to do in my life, is to create not just awareness but acceptance of differences, and say that it's okay to be different. It's okay to say, hang on, can we do things a little bit otherwise, because then I can take part better. And especially to our neurodivergent listeners, it's absolutely okay to run out of spoons and want to stay home and play computer games or read a book. And there is no right choice between theatre and museum.
Yeah, exactly.
Unless it's theatre in a museum, in which case, perfect. Or possibly the opposite of perfect, because who knows?
I'm trying to imagine that. Theatre sounds a bit chaotic.
But yes, no, so hopefully, once I've edited this up, people will get something interesting from this conversation. And remember that it's fine to be disabled. It's not a dirty word. And that you're all doing amazingly and wonderful and everything else. So there you go. All of our listeners are awesome.
And no matter what you do with this day, maybe just give yourself a break and be nice to yourself. That's what I'll try to do.
Yeah, bit of self-care.
Yes.
Self-love, in whichever way you want to take that.
Yes.
Yes, so it only remains for me to say thank you to my amazing guest, Danny, and to wish you all a very pleasant weekend. Take care now. Bye.
Bye.